Good Shabbos, good Yantif, and good Yor. Today is now Rosh Hashanah. As I've been saying to some people that the Homheint is Erev Rosh Hashanah. Today is Erev Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah Eve. Rosh Hashanah has a number of names, by the way, as some of you know. Yom HaTruah, the day of the blowing of the horn, Yom HaZikaron, day of remembrance, and Yom Hadin, the day of judgment. Most of the time when we think of the day of judgment, we think of something as being at the end of time, meaning the end of history. But Rosh Hashanah, it's called the day of judgment. And it is at the end of time, just the end of each year and the beginning of the next. Day of judgment, when we still have the opportunity to do something about it. When time turns. We read in the Talmud, Rosh Hashanah 16b. Rabbi Kruspedai says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that 3 books are opened on Rosh Hashanah. Familiar story. 3 books are opened on Rosh Hashanah in front of the Holy One. One of entirely wicked people, and one of entirely righteous people, and one of in-betweenies, middling people, whose good and bad deeds are equally balanced. Entirely righteous people are immediately written and sealed for life. Entirely wicked people are immediately written and sealed for death. And in-betweenies are left with their judgment suspended from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur. Their fate undecided. If they merit through the good deeds and mitzvot they perform during this period, they are written for life. And if they do not so merit, they are written for death. Now, it must be said that Judaism does not necessarily accept that things are predetermined in this way. As a matter of theology, ideology, intellectual understanding, we don't claim to know enough to know that God works in this way. But our liturgy, the pattern of our prayers, picks up on this motif and has us experience these days by placing ourselves in this situation. It doesn't matter what we think is true or not at the moment. This is the moment. This is the truth of the moment. Even so, it's the truth of the moment with reservation, Because what is it we say? Tshuva, utfila, utzedaka, mavirin et roa hagazera. Tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah. I call that the 3 T's. Tshuva, atonement. Tefillah, prayer. Tzedakah, acts of righteousness. Doesn't prevent the decree. It says helps avert the severity of the decree. That is, they set up the conditions for things to be better. And who can argue with that? Atonement, prayer, and acts of righteousness, that makes things better. The 3 T's. Of note, I would say, I should point out that later on the same page of Talmud, we learn that Shammai says something similar, but different. It is taught that Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai, says, there will be 3 groups of people on Yom Hadin. This time it's the day of judgment, not Rosh Hashanah. It's the day of judgment. There'll be 3 groups of people on the day of judgment at the end of days. One of entirely righteous people, one of entirely wicked people, and one of in-betweenies. Entirely righteous people will immediately be written and sealed for eternal life. Entirely wicked people will immediately be written and sealed for Gehenna. As it is stated, quote, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall wake, some to eternal life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. That's in Daniel. and in-betweenes will descend to Gehenna to be cleansed and achieve atonements for their sins. All of a sudden, we see a parallel here in the Talmud. But it's no longer clear, in this case, if the Talmud is talking about Rosh Hashanah or the end of days. And we have to keep in mind also in the Talmud that these rabbis were not necessarily talking to each other. The text may say Rabbi so-and-so says such a thing and Rabbi so-and-so says such a thing, but these two rabbis could have lived in different centuries. But for the editor, the one who put the language together, that's more or less the later voice. It seems at the end of time, at the end of days, Yom Hadin, at the end of time or at the end of days, seems to be kind of one and the same. The end of the year, the end of days. The end of the year, the end of days. And this says something to me about how Jewish life invites us to think about past and present and future. First, it has to be said, all so often in Jewish life, we look to our past to tell us how we should be in the present. We should be somehow as we were before. If we're to be authentic, we have to somehow be something like we were before. But what would Jewish life look like if present Jewish life were based not on what we envision ourselves to have been in the past, but on what we envision ourselves as destined to be in the future? In the future. And the second point that I'm reminded of is that Judaism asks us to find the eternal in the midst of the now. Find the eternal in the midst of the now. And I want to deal with that idea first. Because what do I mean by that? By saying we are to find the eternal in the midst of the now. When I was trying to find a way to describe this, I came across a book on Safari, a website of ancient and modern Jewish texts, which was co-founded by Joshua Four, a cousin of some of our congregants. And this book, 1979, was authored by Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz, a leading Orthodox Jewish scholar of the last century, was born and educated in Europe before the Holocaust and was later a teacher at Hebrew Theological College in Chicago, and then eventually lived and taught in Jerusalem, where I, at one point, was able to meet him. One of his many books is called With God in Hell. With God in Hell, subtitle, Judaism in the Ghettos and Death Camps, about Jews living through the Holocaust. And Eliezer Berkowitz writes of the work of the Jewish psychotherapist Viktor Frankl, who lived through the camps and worked and wrote extensively after the war. And in the words of Eliezer Berkowitz, Viktor Frankl makes the point that a human being must have a future to live for. But since in the camps one could not see an end to the incarceration, one could not aim at a future. Therefore, he saw his life as provisional. This is one of the causes of so many losing their hold on life. Everything became pointless for them. Future for them meant time beyond camp existence. But in the structured sequence of Jewish life, the future was also the next moment, with its demands and promises waiting to be lived through as a Jew. The future was the continuous anticipation of the meaning and purpose of the next date in his calendar. Pesach, the festival of liberation. Shavuot, the festival of revelation. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, waiting in the wings. Eliezer Berkowitz describes how Frankl in the camps spoke with a sick woman who knew she had only a few more days to live and who nonetheless was expressing gratitude. She said, "In my former life, I was spoiled and did not take spiritual accomplishments seriously." Then, pointing with her finger through the window of the hut, she continued, "This tree here is the only friend I have in my loneliness." All that could be seen through the window was a single branch of a chestnut tree with 2 blossoms in it. She said, "I often talk to this tree. At first, Frankel was startled, imagining that the woman might be delirious or that she suffered from occasional hallucinations. But when he anxiously asked her whether the tree replied back, she said, "Yes, it said to me, I am here, life, eternal life." This woman who found companionship from a tree could look at the tree and she would see the tremendous force of life before her. She was in the presence of the eternal, of eternity, even as she sat in hell at the moment. She was able to see beyond the moment she was in and understand that she was connected to a larger unfolding of life in existence that was far greater than the current moment, but that nonetheless this moment was entirely, intimately part of. And she could see that the eternity she was part of would eventually, in the fullness of time, overcome the temporary moment that was attempting to overwhelm her. Eliezer Berkowitz continues, quite clearly, this young woman did not feel that she was seeing an outside world of unreality as if she were dead or on another planet. In fact, never previously had she been so much alive to the reality of the world. Such are, of course, the unique experiences of unique people. But even though it is remarkable that even though separated from human society, these Jews were not alienated from God's creation. This resulted in one way directly from their continued observance of the seasonal festivals. Passover does not only commemorate the Exodus, it is also the spring festival, Chag HaAviv. Shavuot, when the Torah was given, is Chag HaBikurim, the festival of the first fruits. And Sukkot is the season of our joy, is also a season of harvest. They were not only memories of the past. Jews knew very well that no matter what their personal fate might turn out to be, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, as well as other significant dates in the Jewish calendar, would outlast Nazi Germany. The structured time of the Jewish calendar preserved their contact with the world that brought to them the message of the eternal life of its source. These are not theoretical issues. They are immensely practical. We use tradition to transcend our particular moment. In human life, we are familiar with efforts at time to hold on to a sense of ourself in the midst of chaos. The need to remember who we are and what we are about when life circumstance is starting to overwhelm us. Sometimes it may be the effects of intense busyness from all the commitments we are enmeshed with. Sometimes it is the result of real catastrophe or real loss. In either case, we are struggling to hold on to our sense of self. In Jewish life, we are perhaps familiar with the sense of trying to hold on to who we are as Jews in the midst of so many other cultural pressures and the challenges of living by two calendars and two cultures, a Jewish calendar, Jewish and a Western calendar, Jewish culture, and something vaguely defined that is called American culture. We perhaps are familiar with the call to hold on to who we are by holding on to what we have been in the past. Jewish life, after all, emphasizes this connection with the past and seeks to find models in our past to tell us how to be now in the present. In the Orthodox world, legitimation is sought by finding legal precedent and authorization in halakha, Jewish law. In the non-Orthodox world, we often find an attempt to claim authenticity for particular practices or ways of being by an appeal to history. That is, by finding evidence that once upon a time the Jewish people did it this particular way before. In either case, Orthodox or non-Orthodox, we're looking towards our past to legitimate the future, or to legitimate the present. But Yom Hadin, the day of judgment, is not something that has happened yet. It's not something in the past. This is not a past-oriented approach, but a future-oriented approach. So in this Yom Hadin, I want to raise the question for us, especially at Temple Beth Shalom, we who are in the midst of defining Jewish life for ourselves, if not for others, in a time when so much changes so fast, circumstances do not allow for things to always remain the same. What would Jewish life look like if it were defined not by what we have been in the past, but by what we perceive we are destined to be in the future? What does so-called authentic Jewish life look like when it is defined not by visions of what we, the Jewish people, see ourselves to have been, but rather when Jewish life is defined by visions of what we, the Jewish people, see ourselves as destined to be? A Judaism defined by a vision of our destiny rather than a vision of our heritage. We will not answer this question today. I am raising the question for now, because in many ways, Rosh Hashanah itself raises the question. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Hadin, the Day of Judgment. Yes, Rosh Hashanah bids us to look at our past, to see how we have been both as individuals and as a community. But our prayers are constantly calling of us to change from that past, to become better than we have been. We are not looking to our own past as a model of how to live and to be. Rather, we are looking towards our future, at how we could be better. On Rosh Hashanah, we are asked to envision a better world, a better self to live into. Perhaps then it is most appropriate on Rosh Hashanah, especially, to seek a standard for ourselves not in our traditional past, but in our tradition's habitual view of a favored destiny. A destiny of hope, of wholeness, and of harmony. Also often we are conditioned by the talk of peoples around us that when we hear the phrase end of days, we envision times of violent clashes and conflict. There are many peoples and traditions around us that thrive on the fear of a wrathful God who was looking to punish errant humans at the end of time. But we can envision an alternative end of days, an alternative scenario, one in which there is peace and understanding. In fact, there are prophetic readings in Tanakh that hold out such end of days visions, such as the 2nd chapter of Isaiah. All nations shall flow to God's holy mountain, and God shall adjudicate any conflict between them. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, nor shall they learn war anymore. The images of a lion lying next to the lamb, the call that my house shall be a house of prayer for all peoples. In that day, God will be one, and God's name shall be one. So much of these visions include visions of Shalom, peace, and wholeness. What does it look like to live into this vision of the end of days? To take this vision on an eternal scale and strive to live it in the moment. To place eternity into the now, since the now is where eternity is found. Of special note for us would also have to be descriptions and observances of the Sabbath. Shabbat is an expression of both heritage and of destiny. That is part of what makes it so special in Jewish life. Shabbat represents everything. The only question is exactly how are we to live it out in the immediate present? Looking towards our past, towards history and the detailed rulings of Jewish law, there are many rules that can be applied to Shabbat life that many people today find difficult to adopt. But whatever we do or don't do on Shabbat, Shabbat is meant to take us out of our sense of what is usual and normal, so that we can feel a heightened sense of the eternal in the now. Eliezer Berkowitz continues his description of the important place of Shabbat. And he writes in the same book, if the festivals are chiefly seasonal, the Sabbath has its place in the cosmos. For God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And so God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. Yet the words of one survivor indicate that he experienced the holy day in its cosmic context. When this Holocaust survivor describes, as he remembers, at the time of sunset on the eve of the Sabbath, it would seem as if the fields were being covered with plush carpets in honor of Queen Sabbath. The lights in the faraway little windows flicker as if they're Sabbath candles lit in universal space. Our saintly mothers who kindled those lights hover above in the distant blue. They cover their faces with their hands. They put their hands on our hands and bless us. The stars across the sky twinkle, twinkling Sabbath candles. Soon they will fade and be extinguished. A Sabbath song is in the air, floating in from somewhere behind the woods. Oh, how we wish to sit at the hole of the bunker and let the song filter into us till the rise of the sun. Again, what does it look like to live into hopeful visions of the end of days, such as the Sabbath represents? What does it look like to take the vision of Shabbat on an eternal scale and strive to live it in the moment, placing eternity into the now, since the now is where eternity is found? Perhaps it means we strive to become communities of Shalom, first and foremost. So one way for us to approach living out our practice of Shabbat is to think about how Shabbat positions us to live into our own vision of who we are as agents of Shalom in the world. What does Shabbat look like in our lives when we are guided by our sense of how the world might be in a time of harmony and Shalom? Interfaith dialogue is another form of modeling a harmonious end of days. Indeed, the contemporary Jewish scholar Stephen Kepnes describes interfaith dialogue itself as an exercise in eschatology. Eschatology is the study of the end times. As many of you know, for 40 years, I have been actively involved in interfaith dialogue, interfaith learning, interfaith action and commemoration. This summer, I attended the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago. Over 6,000 people from all over the world, of many different languages, many different traditions, wearing many different modes of dress, gathered together to learn from each other, to connect with each other, and to find more ways to work with each other to build deeper interfaith understanding. The operative assumption that which drove this gathering was that there can be no peace among the nations without peace among the world religions. There can be no peace among the world religions without dialogue between world religions. There can be no dialogue between world religions without a shared ethical basis of engagement. So interfaith dialogue is an exercise in eschatology. When we engage in interfaith dialogue, we are modeling in the now a time of Shalom that we wish to see in the future, and that parts of Jewish tradition describe as an aspect of the end of time. An interfaith dialogue is, in itself, won't bring about world peace, but it is essential for creating the conditions which could allow something to come about. So building bridges across divides of faith may be another way our sense of destiny might lead us. Now, I would say perhaps that would be appropriate for a community named Temple Beth Shalom, as Beth Shalom means house of peace. Temple Beth Shalom might strive to become a community dedicated to building bridges of shalom among ourselves and in the world around us. Dedicated to building bridges of shalom among ourselves and in the world around us. Perhaps that is a future-oriented mission statement for our community. But we can, I hope, discuss more about how we see ourselves as community tomorrow and in the weeks to come. For now, I will say Shabbat Shalom and Lashana Tova Tekatevu. May we all be inscribed in the book of life.